Hundreds of millions of years before dinosaurs ruled the Earth, the skies already belonged to giant insects and strange creatures almost nobody remembers today. Tonight, we're traveling back into the dark, prehistoric forests of the Carboniferous world to explore how these massive arthropods once survived, hunted, and disappeared beneath ancient skies. Welcome to Sleepy Earth Channel. Before we begin, let me know down in the comments which city you're watching from tonight, and gently drift back with me into a forgotten world older than dinosaurs themselves. Hundreds of millions of years before the first dinosaur ever placed a foot on Earth, this planet already belonged to something else. Not giant reptiles, not mammals, not even creatures with bones strong enough to dominate the land. The rulers of the ancient world were smaller, stranger, and in some ways far more alien than anything most people imagine when they think about prehistory. If you could stand in the middle of Earth during the late Carboniferous Period, roughly 320 million years ago, almost nothing around you would feel familiar. The sky would look heavier somehow, thick with moisture and haze. The air itself would feel different in your lungs, richer, denser, carrying far more oxygen than the modern world. Some estimates suggest oxygen levels may have reached over 30% of the atmosphere, compared to about 21% today. That difference sounds small on paper, but on prehistoric Earth, it may have changed almost everything. Forests stretched endlessly across enormous, swampy continents. Giant club mosses rose like primitive towers, nearly 100 feet tall. Ferns spread across wet ground in layers so dense that sunlight barely reached the mud below. There were no flowers yet, no birds singing from branches, no grass moving in the wind. The world was green, dark, wet, and strangely silent, except for the sounds of water, distant cracking wood, and the constant movement of creatures hidden inside the vegetation. And above all of it, something moved through the misty air. Not birds. Birds would not exist for another 100 million years. These were insects, but not the insects people know today. Some were so large that their shadows may have looked unsettling, even to the early amphibians crawling beneath them. One of the most famous was Meganeura, a distant relative of the modern dragonfly, with a wingspan that could reach over 2 feet wide. That means a creature resembling a dragonfly once flew through Earth's skies at roughly the size of a hawk. For decades, scientists have debated exactly why these insects became so enormous. The oxygen-rich atmosphere is still considered one of the strongest explanations, because insects breathe differently from mammals. They do not use lungs. Instead, oxygen moves through tiny openings in their bodies, called spiracles, and travels through branching tubes known as tracheae. In a world with much more oxygen available, this system may have supported larger bodies far more effectively than it can today. But oxygen alone may not explain everything. Some researchers suspect another reason insects thrived was because the skies were almost empty of competition. There were no birds hunting them, no bats chasing them through the darkness. Vertebrate flight had not yet truly begun. For millions of years, insects occupied an ecological kingdom with relatively few rivals, and evolution tends to reward any organism that finds open territory before something else does. The result was a world where the balance of fear worked differently. Today, humans barely notice dragonflies near ponds. Back then, smaller creatures may have reacted to the sound of beating wings the same way modern animals react to aerial predators. And the strange thing is that these giant insects were only part of the story. The land itself was transforming into one of the most unusual ecosystems Earth has ever produced. The continents during this period were arranged differently, slowly drifting together into the supercontinent Pangaea. Vast equatorial swamps covered enormous regions that would one day become North America and Europe. The climate was humid and unstable, with heavy rainfall feeding endless wetlands where dead plant matter accumulated faster than it could fully decay. Over immense stretches of time, those buried forests eventually became the coal deposits humans still mine today. In a sense, modern civilization runs partly on the compressed remains of prehistoric swamp forests that existed before dinosaurs were even real. That idea alone changes how ancient this world truly was. The coal-powering factories, trains, and cities may contain the remains of forests where giant insects once flew through dim green light. But what made this era feel especially uncanny was not simply the size of life. It was the atmosphere of incompleteness. Earth still seemed unfinished. Vertebrates had only recently begun exploring land seriously. Amphibian-like creatures crawled through mud and shallow water, but many still depended heavily on wet environments to survive. Reptiles were only beginning to emerge. The ecosystems lacked the familiar complexity modern humans instinctively expect. There were no mammals watching from trees, no birds migrating overhead, no flowering plants filling the air with color. It was a world dominated by spores, mist, mud, and enormous arthropods moving through shadows. Some scientists believe this period represented one of the most oxygen-rich moments in Earth's history, but high oxygen came with consequences. Fires may have been far more dangerous. Even damp vegetation could potentially ignite more easily under certain conditions. Geological evidence suggests wildfire activity increased during parts of the Carboniferous, creating cycles of destruction and regrowth that reshaped entire ecosystems. Imagine a prehistoric forest already filled with giant insects, suddenly illuminated by massive walls of fire moving through oxygen-rich air. It would have looked less like Earth and more like another planet trying to become stable. Yet, despite how terrifying this environment sounds, it was also incredibly productive. Life was experimenting rapidly. Evolution had not settled into the familiar structures humans know now. Nature was testing possibilities. Some worked for millions of years. Others disappeared completely. That is part of what makes prehistoric Earth so unsettling to think about. The modern world can create the illusion that evolution always moved toward creatures like us, But the Carboniferous reminds us that life had no obligation to become human-shaped, intelligent, or even recognizable. If environmental conditions had remained different long enough, ecosystems dominated by giant arthropods might have continued evolving in ways difficult to imagine today. There is even an uncomfortable realization hidden inside that thought. Humans tend to see insects as primitive because of their size and simplicity compared to mammals. But for a vast stretch of Earth's history, insects were among the most successful life forms on the planet. They adapted quickly, spread everywhere, survived environmental collapses, and occupied ecological niches long before humans existed. In many ways, they still do. Even today, insects remain among the most diverse groups of organisms on Earth. The difference is that modern ecosystems keep their size constrained. But during the Carboniferous, nature briefly removed some of those limitations, and the result was a world that feels almost mythological now. Fossils from this era continue to surprise researchers because they reveal how unfamiliar early terrestrial ecosystems truly were. Some arthropods reached lengths over 6 feet. Massive millipede-like creatures known as arthropleura crawled across swamp floors, leaving trackways preserved in ancient rock. Despite their intimidating appearance, many scientists think they were likely herbivores or detritivores, feeding on decaying plant material. But that uncertainty itself is important. Paleontology often works through fragments, impressions, and educated reconstruction. Every fossil contains clues, but also gaps. Scientists can estimate anatomy, movement, and relationships, yet many behaviors remain impossible to prove completely. That uncertainty keeps prehistoric Earth mysterious in a way modern ecosystems are not. There are entire sounds, movements, and interactions from this world that no human will ever witness directly. Even the colors of many ancient creatures remain debated. Meganeura may have shimmered dark blue like modern dragonflies, or perhaps reflected muddy greens beneath swamp sunlight. No one truly knows. And perhaps that unknowability is part of why this era captures the imagination so strongly. It feels less like history and more like discovering evidence of another lost planet hidden beneath our own. What is most fascinating is how temporary this dominance really was. At the time, giant insects may have seemed unstoppable, perfectly adapted to their environment. But Earth was already changing beneath them. Oxygen levels would eventually decline. Climates would shift. New predators would evolve. The skies would not remain empty forever. The rise of vertebrate flight millions of years later may have placed enormous pressure on giant insects that once ruled uncontested airspace. Evolution rewards success, but only temporarily. Every dominant species exists inside environmental conditions that can eventually disappear. The Carboniferous world reminds us that nature does not create permanent empires. It creates experiments. Some last thousands of years, some survive for millions, but eventually the planet changes the rules again. And somewhere inside those endless swamp forests, beneath the heavy air and drifting mist, the first hints of another age were already beginning to emerge. Not the age of insects, not even yet the age of dinosaurs, but the beginning of a long transition toward a different Earth entirely, one that would slowly erase this strange, forgotten world until almost nothing remained except buried coal, fossilized wings, and the uneasy realization that before giant reptiles ruled prehistory, the sky already belonged to monsters. Long before the first eagle ever circled above a mountain, before pterosaurs crossed prehistoric coastlines, before birds learned how to ride the wind itself, something else had already mastered the skies of Earth. It moved through humid air above endless swamps, with 4 transparent wings stretched wide like living glass. It hunted with speed so sudden that smaller creatures may never have even understood what killed them. And unlike modern dragonflies that most people barely notice near ponds and lakes, this predator was large enough that its shadow could have triggered instinctive fear in almost anything beneath it. Its name is now known as Meganeura, one of the most famous giant insects ever discovered, though in many ways the fossil record still leaves it wrapped in mystery. Some estimates place its wingspan at over 70 centimeters wide, nearly the size of certain modern hawks. But what makes Meganeura unsettling is not simply its size. It is the realization that this creature existed during a time when the sky itself was almost empty. There were no birds competing with it, no bats hunting at dusk, no advanced flying vertebrates chasing prey through the forests. For millions of years, giant insects occupied an aerial kingdom with relatively little opposition, and evolution took advantage of that freedom with astonishing results. If a human somehow stood beneath the swamp forests of the late Carboniferous and looked upward through the dense canopy haze, the experience would likely feel deeply wrong in a way difficult to explain. The world would appear familiar at first glance because forests, water, clouds, and wind still existed. But the movement overhead would immediately break that illusion. Giant, dragonfly-like predators crossing between ancient trees would not move like birds. Insects fly differently. Their motion is sharper, less predictable, more mechanical, and alien to the human eye. Modern dragonflies already possess an almost unnatural level of aerial control. They can hover, reverse direction, accelerate suddenly, and intercept moving prey with extraordinary precision. Some scientists estimate modern dragonflies successfully catch prey in the vast majority of their attacks, making them among the most efficient hunters alive today. Meganeura may have inherited similar abilities on a far larger scale. That possibility changes how the ancient sky should be imagined. It was not simply filled with oversized insects drifting slowly through warm air. It may have contained fast-moving aerial predators capable of rapid pursuit over dark swamp waters where early amphibians and smaller arthropods struggled to survive. Fossils suggest Meganeura belonged to a group closely related to dragonflies and damselflies, though technically it was not identical to modern species. Its wings reveal a complex network of veins designed for strength and maneuverability, and some paleontologists believe those wings may have produced a constant, dry, rattling sound while flying through humid air. Imagine hearing that noise before seeing the creature itself. In a forest already thick with mist and towering vegetation, the sound alone could have felt ominous. The unsettling part is that giant insects like Meganeura were not failed experiments. They were successful organisms adapted perfectly for their world. Humans often imagine prehistoric life as crude or primitive, but Meganeura represented millions of years of refinement, shaped by environmental pressures modern ecosystems barely resemble anymore. Its enormous eyes likely gave it exceptional motion detection. Its jaws were built for gripping prey mid-air. Every feature suggests specialization rather than awkward gigantism. And yet, scientists still debate exactly how such creatures flew at all. Some researchers believe the oxygen-rich atmosphere played the most important role. Insects rely on passive oxygen diffusion through tiny respiratory tubes rather than lungs. As body size increases, delivering oxygen efficiently becomes more difficult. Higher atmospheric oxygen may have allowed insects to overcome some of those limits. But there are competing theories as well. Certain scientists argue that ancient aerodynamic conditions, climate stability, predator absence, and ecological opportunity may have mattered just as much as oxygen levels themselves. In reality, prehistoric ecosystems rarely depend on a single explanation. Life evolves through combinations of pressure, opportunity, accident, and adaptation, unfolding over immense stretches of time. Meganeura existed because the Carboniferous world allowed it to exist. That may sound obvious, but it reveals something important about evolution itself. Nature does not move toward perfection. It moves toward temporary success inside specific environmental conditions. In another version of Earth, where atmospheric chemistry remained different for long enough, perhaps giant flying arthropods could have continued evolving into forms even more unfamiliar than anything found in fossils. Some speculative reconstructions imagine larger aerial hunters developing new strategies, behaviors, or territorial dominance patterns had vertebrate flight not eventually emerged. Of course, no scientist can say that with certainty, but the possibility itself highlights how fragile evolutionary history really is. Humans often see the modern world as inevitable, yet the Carboniferous reminds us that Earth could have become something profoundly different. The skies dominated by birds today might once have remained insect territory for tens of millions of years longer under slightly altered circumstances. And perhaps the strangest thing about Meganeura is how recognizable it still appears, despite the immense gulf of time separating it from the modern world. Looking at reconstructions, people instantly understand what it resembles, because dragonflies still exist today. That connection creates an unusual psychological effect. Dinosaurs can feel distant because nothing alive now truly resembles them closely enough. But giant dragonflies trigger a more immediate discomfort because humans already know the smaller version. The brain automatically scales upward, something familiar and harmless, into something ancient and threatening. It becomes easier to imagine standing near swamp water while one passes overhead. Easier to picture wings flashing through humid sunlight. Easier to imagine prey animals freezing at sudden movement in the air. In some ways, giant insects feel more believable than dinosaurs, precisely because modern insects remain everywhere around us. They are living reminders of a much older Earth. Even the hunting methods of modern dragonflies offer clues about what Meganeura's world may have looked like. Dragonflies are visual predators. They intercept moving prey through rapid aerial calculations, almost like biological guided missiles. Research has shown that dragonflies do not simply chase prey randomly. They predict movement trajectories, adjusting position mid-flight with remarkable efficiency. If giant prehistoric relatives behaved similarly, then the skies above Carboniferous wetlands were likely filled with highly specialized hunters operating in complex ecological networks. Smaller insects would have evolved escape behaviors. Juvenile amphibians may have hidden beneath vegetation to avoid aerial attacks. Entire food webs may have depended on the movement patterns of giant flying predators humans will never observe directly. That unknowability matters because prehistoric Earth often becomes simplified in popular imagination into static museum scenes. In reality, these ecosystems were dynamic, violent, and constantly shifting. Every swamp pool, fallen tree, and fog-covered shoreline likely hosted countless interactions, now lost forever, except through fragments of stone. There is also a deeper irony hidden inside the rise of giant dragonflies. Flight itself is one of evolution's most difficult achievements. It requires extraordinary energy control, lightweight anatomy, environmental opportunity, and precise adaptation. Yet insects solved flight long before vertebrates ever approached it. By the time reptiles and eventually pterosaurs evolved into the sky, insects had already been aerial specialists for millions upon millions of years. In a sense, Meganeura belonged to one of Earth's oldest successful aviation lineages. And despite all their apparent dominance, giant dragonflies still lived inside a dangerous and unstable world. Carboniferous forests were unpredictable environments shaped by floods, oxygen fluctuations, storms, and wildfire cycles. Fossil evidence suggests climates shifted repeatedly over time, restructuring habitats across entire continents. Success during one geological period offered no guarantee of survival in the next. That truth appears again and again throughout Earth's history. Dominant species often seem invincible right before conditions begin changing against them. The terrifying hunters of one era become fossils in another. What survives is not always the strongest organism, but the one most capable of adapting when the world itself transforms. And eventually, the skies that once belonged to giant insects began changing. Early vertebrates were evolving new possibilities. Reptilian ancestors were diversifying. The balance of ecosystems slowly shifted away from the swamp-dominated conditions that had allowed enormous arthropods to flourish. Oxygen levels gradually declined from their ancient highs. Competition increased. New predators emerged. The age of giant dragonflies did not end suddenly like a disaster movie. It faded across immense stretches of time, almost impossible for the human mind to fully grasp. Yet traces of that forgotten sky still survive in modern dragonflies, skimming quietly across lakes at sunset. Their transparent wings, rapid turns, and sudden hovering movements are echoes from a world older than dinosaurs. And perhaps that is why dragonflies feel strangely timeless, even now. Somewhere deep in their design, is the memory of an Earth where insects once ruled the air, where swamp forests stretched across continents beneath heavy clouds, and where a creature resembling a dragonfly could descend from the mist not as decoration beside a pond, but as one of the most successful aerial predators on the planet. If the ancient sky once belonged to giant insects, then the ground below belonged to something even stranger. Not predators with teeth the size of knives, not reptiles roaring through jungles. The rulers of the prehistoric forest floor were creatures so alien to modern instincts that even imagining them moving through darkness feels uncomfortable. They had dozens of legs, armored bodies, and movements that seemed less like animals and more like living machines built by another version of Earth entirely. And among them, one creature stood above all the others in sheer scale. Its name was Arthropods, a colossal relative of modern millipedes and centipedes that may have reached lengths over 8 feet long. That means, long before dinosaurs dominated the land, Earth already supported giant multi-legged arthropods crawling silently through endless swamp forests beneath heavy clouds and oxygen-rich air. The unsettling part is not only that such creatures existed, but that for millions of years they were normal. Imagine walking through a Carboniferous forest at ground level. The air is thick with humidity. The soil beneath your feet feels unstable, soft with layers of rotting vegetation and black water hidden under dense ferns. Towering plants rise overhead like pillars in green darkness. There are no birds calling from branches, no mammals rustling through leaves. The ecosystem feels unfinished, almost abandoned by the familiar rhythms modern humans unconsciously expect from nature. Then, somewhere nearby, you hear movement. Not footsteps exactly, more like a long, dragging rustle moving through wet undergrowth. Branches shift, ferns bend slowly outward, and emerging from the shadows comes a segmented body armored in overlapping plates, stretching farther than the human brain comfortably associates with an arthropod. Arthropods did not resemble the monsters of modern cinema because real prehistoric life rarely needed exaggeration. Its sheer existence was enough. Fossils discovered in Europe and North America reveal enormous trackways preserved in ancient sediments, some showing evidence of creatures moving through muddy landscapes hundreds of millions of years ago. For a long time, paleontologists struggled to fully understand what kind of animal created them. Eventually, fossil fragments and body impressions helped reconstruct Arthropods as one of the largest land arthropods ever known. Yet, despite its intimidating appearance, scientists still debate important aspects of its behavior. There is no strong evidence that Arthropods hunted large prey. Many researchers suspect it may have been primarily herbivorous or detritivorous, feeding on decaying plant matter covering swamp floors. In other words, one of the most terrifying-looking creatures in Earth's early terrestrial ecosystems may have spent much of its life slowly consuming dead vegetation beneath ancient forests. That contradiction reveals something fascinating about evolution. human fear often reacts more strongly to unfamiliar shape and movement than actual danger. A tiger is objectively more lethal than a giant millipede-like animal, yet many people would probably feel more immediate discomfort standing beside Arthropleura. Part of that reaction comes from the way arthropods move. Mammals and reptiles share enough structural similarity with humans that our brains instinctively recognize their body language. Arthropods operate differently. Their limbs move in patterns humans do not emotionally relate to. Their faces lack expressions humans understand. Their segmented bodies create a sense of mechanical repetition that feels almost unnatural when scaled upward. Even modern centipedes trigger fear responses disproportionate to their actual threat level. Now, imagine that instinct amplified by a creature over 8 feet long, emerging from mist-covered vegetation in dim, prehistoric light. Yet, Carboniferous Earth allowed such organisms to thrive because the environment itself operated under different biological rules. Oxygen levels remained unusually high. Climates were warm and wet across enormous regions, and terrestrial ecosystems still lacked many of the vertebrate competitors that would later dominate land environments. Arthropods had opportunities that no longer exist today. And unlike modern ecosystems crowded with birds, mammals, reptiles, and flowering plants, these ancient forests were simpler in some ways, but also more alien. Vast stretches of swamp vegetation created endless food sources for organisms capable of processing dead plant material. Arthropleura may have functioned almost like a giant recycling system, moving through prehistoric forests, breaking down organic matter and helping nutrients circulate through ecosystems still evolving toward greater complexity. But the deeper scientists study these environments, the stranger they become. Some fossil evidence suggests these giant arthropods navigated landscapes shaped by unstable climate cycles, floods, oxygen surges, and wildfire activity. In certain regions, forests collapsed and regrew repeatedly over geological timescales. That means Arthropleura did not live inside a peaceful, static paradise. It survived within ecosystems constantly shifting beneath environmental pressures difficult for modern humans to fully imagine. There is also a more unsettling possibility hidden in the fossil record. While Arthropleura itself may not have been an aggressive predator, not all giant arthropods were harmless. Early terrestrial ecosystems contained massive predatory relatives of scorpions and centipedes, some equipped with venomous adaptations or crushing mouthparts capable of overpowering smaller organisms. Fossil evidence from slightly older periods even reveals giant sea scorpions known as eurypterids reaching terrifying sizes in aquatic environments before many vertebrates became dominant. Some species may have exceeded 8 feet long underwater. Though most giant sea scorpions disappeared before Arthropleura's time, their existence demonstrates something important about prehistoric Earth. Arthropods were not marginal creatures hiding beneath rocks. For enormous stretches of evolutionary history, they were among the dominant, large-bodied organisms on the planet. Humans often associate size and dominance with vertebrates because modern ecosystems are built around them. But the Carboniferous reminds us that evolution once experimented with entirely different rulers. And perhaps the strangest part is how silent this world may have felt compared to modern nature. Today, forests are filled with birdsong, mammal calls, and insect choruses. Carboniferous soundscapes would have been profoundly different. Giant arthropods moving through undergrowth likely produced scraping, clicking, or rustling noises rather than vocal calls. Amphibian-like creatures may have made low, primitive sounds near swamps, but much of the environment was probably dominated by wind, water, and movement rather than recognizable animal communication. That silence may have made giant arthropods feel even more alien. A modern predator announces itself through growls, roars, or cries humans instinctively interpret. Arthropleura may have approached almost wordlessly, its movement hidden beneath the damp breathing sounds of the forest itself. Some paleontologists also wonder whether Arthropleura possessed defensive chemical systems similar to certain modern millipedes, many of which release toxic or foul-smelling substances when threatened. If so, prehistoric forests may occasionally have carried strange chemical odors humans would find completely unfamiliar today. The Carboniferous was not merely visually different from the modern world. It may have smelled different, sounded different, even felt different against the skin, because atmospheric chemistry itself had changed. And hidden inside all of this is a larger truth about Earth's history that many people rarely think about. The planet humans know is only one temporary version among countless others. Forests, skies, oceans, and ecosystems have transformed repeatedly across geological time, sometimes into forms almost unrecognizable compared to the present. If humans traveled backward far enough, Earth would eventually stop feeling like home altogether. The age of giant arthropods represents one of those moments. A period when evolution followed pathways that now seem bizarre, only because they disappeared long before human memory existed. Yet, despite their success, these enormous land arthropods eventually declined. The reasons remain complex and debated. Oxygen levels likely fell over time. Climate patterns shifted. Ecosystems became drier in many regions. Vertebrates diversified and occupied ecological niches arthropods once controlled more freely. Nature changed the conditions that had supported giant forms. And like many dominant organisms throughout Earth's history, Arthropleura vanished, not because it suddenly became weak, but because the world around it stopped favoring the traits that once made it successful. There is something strangely haunting about that idea. For millions of years, creatures like Arthropleura crawled through forests, believing nothing in an evolutionary sense, because evolution does not plan ahead. Organisms survive only moment by moment inside current conditions. Yet, hidden beyond their world, geological forces were already reshaping continents, atmospheres, and climates in ways that would slowly erase them from existence. Eventually, the giant arthropods disappeared, leaving behind only fossil fragments, trackways pressed into ancient mud, and an unsettling reminder buried beneath modern forests and cities. Before dinosaurs rose to power, Earth once belonged to creatures with too many legs, armored bodies stretching through swamp shadows, and movements so alien that even now, hundreds of millions of years later, the human imagination still struggles to fully accept that they were real. There was something different about the air itself during the age of giant insects. Not just warmer, not simply wetter. Different in a way that would immediately affect every breath a modern human tried to take. If someone could step into a carboniferous forest and inhale deeply, the atmosphere might feel strangely heavy, almost intoxicating at first, as though the world carried more energy inside it. Scientists believe oxygen levels during parts of this era may have risen to around 30 to 35% of the atmosphere, far above modern levels. Today, Earth's atmosphere contains roughly 21% oxygen, and that balance quietly controls almost every form of complex life on the planet. Most humans never think about it, because modern air feels normal only because human bodies evolved inside it. But when atmospheric chemistry changes even slightly across geological time, entire ecosystems can begin transforming in ways that seem almost impossible afterward. The Carboniferous world may be one of the clearest examples of that principle ever discovered. The giant insects, the towering swamp forests, the massive arthropods crawling beneath ferns, all of it may have been connected by the invisible chemistry of the sky itself. And that idea is deeply unsettling, because it suggests Earth's atmosphere does not simply support life, it shapes what kinds of life are even possible. Oxygen is often described as the fuel for complex organisms, but during the Carboniferous, it may have acted almost like an evolutionary amplifier. Insects especially appear tied to this mystery because of how differently they breathe compared to mammals. Humans use lungs and blood, rich with hemoglobin, to transport oxygen throughout the body. Insects rely on a simpler but highly efficient system of spiracles and tiny branching air tubes called tracheae that deliver oxygen directly into tissues. For smaller bodies, this works remarkably well, but as insects grow larger, oxygen transport becomes increasingly difficult. There appears to be a physical limit where body size eventually outpaces the efficiency of passive diffusion, unless, perhaps, the surrounding atmosphere contains far more oxygen than modern Earth does. This is one of the main reasons scientists believe giant insects became possible during the Carboniferous. Higher oxygen concentrations may have allowed arthropods to grow to extraordinary sizes without suffocating under their own biological limitations. Yet even this explanation remains incomplete. Some researchers caution that oxygen alone cannot fully account for everything seen in the fossil record. Evolution rarely operates through a single cause. Predator absence, climate conditions, ecological opportunity, and ancient atmospheric pressure may all have interacted together in ways difficult to reconstruct perfectly. But the oxygen theory remains powerful partly because it changes how people imagine prehistoric Earth. Most documentaries focus on the creatures themselves, but the true giant of the Carboniferous may have been the atmosphere surrounding them. The sky was not simply a backdrop to evolution, it was an active force shaping the scale of life below. And perhaps the strangest part is how this oxygen-rich world may have formed in the first place. The answer appears connected to forests so enormous and widespread that they altered planetary chemistry over millions of years. During the Carboniferous, vast swamp ecosystems covered huge portions of Earth's equatorial regions. Plants thrived in warm, wet climates and grew faster than decomposers could fully break them down. Massive amounts of dead vegetation accumulated in waterlogged environments, where decay slowed dramatically. Normally, decomposition returns carbon to the atmosphere through processes involving oxygen consumption. But in these prehistoric swamps, much of that organic material became buried before fully decomposing. Over immense spans of time, those buried plant layers eventually transformed into coal deposits. This process effectively trapped enormous quantities of carbon underground, while allowing oxygen to continue accumulating in the atmosphere. In a sense, the forests themselves may have slowly reshaped the air of Earth, until the entire planet entered one of the most oxygen-rich periods in its history. That connection between forests and atmospheric chemistry feels almost poetic now. The giant insects may not have existed without the endless swamp forests, and the swamp forests themselves were slowly changing the atmosphere through processes unfolding across millions of years. Earth was not static. It was operating like a gigantic interconnected system where plants, climate, chemistry, and evolution constantly influenced one another. Yet high oxygen came with consequences beyond giant arthropods. Some scientists believe wildfire behavior during the Carboniferous may have been dramatically different from today. When oxygen concentrations rise, fire becomes easier to ignite and more intense once burning begins. Geological evidence suggests charcoal deposits increased during certain intervals of this period, implying large fires may have swept through prehistoric forests more frequently than expected. Imagine standing inside one of those ancient swamps during a dry cycle. Thick vegetation stretches endlessly into fog-covered distance. The air itself carries extra oxygen. Then somewhere, perhaps from lightning, fire begins. Under such atmospheric conditions, flames could spread with terrifying intensity. Entire forests may have erupted into massive infernos, unlike anything most modern ecosystems regularly experience. The same atmosphere supporting giant life may also have made the planet more dangerous and unstable, and that tension appears repeatedly throughout Earth's history. Conditions that allow extraordinary growth often carry hidden costs. The Carboniferous world may have seemed biologically unstoppable at times, overflowing with life and expansion. Yet beneath that abundance were environmental forces capable of sudden destruction. There is another mystery hidden inside the oxygen story that continues to fascinate researchers. Some studies suggest giant insects declined as oxygen levels later dropped, supporting the idea that atmospheric chemistry directly constrained body size. But not every scientist agrees on how strong this relationship truly was. Certain experiments and models imply that some modern insects could theoretically grow larger under higher oxygen conditions, while others suggest additional evolutionary pressures would still limit them. This uncertainty matters because it reminds us that prehistoric ecosystems cannot be reduced to simple explanations. Nature is rarely controlled by a single switch. Still, even if oxygen was only part of the story, it may have fundamentally changed the feel of the world itself. The Carboniferous atmosphere might have altered metabolism, fire behavior, growth patterns, and ecological competition simultaneously. Earth may have operated almost like a different planet, wearing familiar geography. The thought becomes even stranger when considering human survival inside such an environment. Some researchers speculate modern humans, exposed long-term to Carboniferous oxygen levels, might experience both benefits and risks. Higher oxygen can improve certain biological functions temporarily, but excessive exposure over time may also increase oxidative stress and tissue damage. In other words, the atmosphere that helped giant insects thrive may not have been entirely comfortable or safe for modern human biology. Even breathing the air of prehistoric Earth might eventually feel unnatural. And perhaps that is what makes the Carboniferous so captivating. It was not simply a world with strange creatures. It was a fundamentally altered version of Earth, where invisible planetary conditions reshaped what evolution could build. The giant insects become easier to understand once the atmosphere itself is viewed as part of the ecosystem, rather than empty space above it. Air was a resource, a pressure system, a biological boundary controlling which forms of life flourished and which failed. In many ways, humans underestimate atmospheric chemistry because modern conditions appear stable across ordinary lifetimes. But Earth's atmosphere has transformed repeatedly over billions of years. There were times with almost no oxygen at all, times when toxic gases dominated, times when oceans themselves struggled to support complex life. The Carboniferous sits inside that long history as one of the planet's great atmospheric experiments. And like all experiments in Earth's past, it eventually ended. Oxygen levels gradually declined. Climate patterns shifted. The swamp forests that helped generate oxygen-rich conditions began collapsing in many regions as continental arrangements and global climates changed. The balance supporting giant arthropods weakened slowly across immense stretches of time. The atmosphere that once allowed dragonflies the size of hawks and arthropods longer than humans eventually disappeared. Not overnight, not through one catastrophe, but through countless environmental changes accumulating across millions of years until the world simply no longer favored such creatures. And hidden inside that slow transformation is a quiet reminder about life on Earth that feels almost haunting. Every species, every ecosystem, every dominant form of life depends on conditions that can eventually vanish. The giant insects of the Carboniferous did not fail because they were weak. They failed because the sky itself changed. The very air that once lifted them into prehistoric forests slowly became something else. And today, when modern dragonflies skim quietly over lakes beneath a thinner atmosphere humans take for granted, they carry echoes of that forgotten world inside their design. Remnants of an age when oxygen-rich skies helped create creatures so enormous that even now, hundreds of millions of years later, they still feel more like mythology than biology. The forests of the Carboniferous world were not beautiful in the way modern forests are beautiful. They did not feel welcoming, balanced, or alive with familiar sounds. They felt ancient, even by prehistoric standards, as though Earth itself was still experimenting with what a forest could become. If someone stepped into one of these swamp-covered regions more than 300 million years ago, the first sensation would probably not be fear. It would be disorientation. The air would feel thick enough to touch, Mist would drift constantly between trunks that did not resemble modern trees at all. There would be no flowers anywhere, no grass beneath your feet, no birds moving through branches overhead. Instead, enormous club mosses and primitive tree ferns rose upward in dense black-green layers, some reaching heights over 100 feet tall, while reproducing not through seeds, but through clouds of spores released into humid air. The ground itself barely looked solid. Every step sank slightly into wet soil, layered with decaying vegetation that never fully dried. Pools of dark water reflected almost no light beneath the thick canopy. Sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, and when it did, it arrived in pale shafts through fog and drifting moisture, creating a world that felt permanently trapped between dusk and dawn. Scientists believe these swamp forests stretched across enormous equatorial regions during the late Carboniferous, covering parts of what would eventually become North America and Europe. But calling them forests may actually undersell how strange they were. Modern forests feel stable because humans evolved alongside flowering plants, birds, mammals, and relatively familiar ecosystems. The Carboniferous forests belonged to a different biological logic entirely. Their silence alone would have disturbed a modern observer. There were no songbirds, no insect choruses like the ones filling summer nights today. The sounds came instead from moving water, cracking vegetation, distant thunder, and the dry mechanical movement of arthropods hidden beneath leaves. Giant dragonflies crossed above dark pools. Massive millipede-like creatures moved through rotting plant matter. Amphibian ancestors lurked near shallow waterways, waiting for smaller organisms to pass. The ecosystem lacked anything emotionally recognizable to the human brain. And perhaps that is what made it feel so unsettling. It was Earth, but not yet the Earth humans unconsciously expect. Some paleontologists believe oxygen-rich conditions helped these forests grow at astonishing rates. Warm climates and constant moisture created nearly endless biological productivity. Plants absorbed enormous amounts of carbon dioxide while releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, gradually helping create one of the highest oxygen periods in Earth's history. Yet hidden beneath that abundance was a strange imbalance. The organisms capable of efficiently breaking down wood and plant fibers had not fully evolved yet. Certain fungi and microbes modern ecosystems rely on were either absent or far less effective during much of the Carboniferous. That meant dead vegetation accumulated faster than it decomposed. Entire forests slowly collapsed into swamp water where layers of plant matter buried themselves over millions of years. Eventually, pressure and geological time transformed those buried forests into coal. This means many modern coal deposits are not just ancient plant material. They are the compressed remains of a vanished world that once existed beneath black, prehistoric skies. In a strange way, modern cities powered by coal once burned fragments of forgotten swamp forests where giant insects flew through humid darkness hundreds of millions of years ago. But the deeper scientists examine these ecosystems, the more they appear almost unstable by modern standards. The atmosphere contained unusually high oxygen concentrations, and while that helped support giant arthropods and explosive plant growth, it may also have made wildfire behavior far more dangerous. Geological evidence suggests fire became increasingly common in some Carboniferous environments. Imagine forests already thick with oxygen, suddenly igniting after lightning storms. Flames could move through vegetation with terrifying intensity, consuming enormous regions before dying out in flooded wetlands. Some researchers suspect these recurring cycles of growth and destruction shaped the evolution of early terrestrial ecosystems more than previously understood. The forests were not peaceful, endless swamps frozen in time. They were dynamic, violent systems, constantly rebuilding themselves after environmental stress. And because continents during this era were slowly colliding into the supercontinent Pangaea, climates across Earth were beginning to shift in ways many organisms could not fully adapt to. What makes these forests especially haunting is that they represent one of the earliest moments when Earth began creating truly complex land ecosystems at large scale. Before this, much of life remained concentrated in oceans or relatively simple coastal environments. The Carboniferous changed that. Land itself became crowded with biological experiments. Towering vegetation altered weather patterns. Swamps changed atmospheric chemistry. Arthropods expanded into enormous ecological niches. The planet was no longer just supporting life. Life was beginning to reshape the planet in return. There is something strangely modern about that realization. Humans often think of environmental transformation as uniquely human. Yet long before civilization existed, forests were already changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and influencing climate systems globally. The Carboniferous reminds us that life and environment are never truly separate forces. They evolve together. Yet, despite the abundance of life, these forests may have felt emotionally empty in a way modern environments do not. There were no mammals caring for young in nests or dens, no birds building social hierarchies overhead. Many Carboniferous organisms likely behaved according to instincts far more alien to human understanding. Giant arthropods moved through undergrowth with no expressions humans could recognize. Amphibian-like predators waited silently in black water. Reproduction often depended on spores drifting invisibly through humid air, or eggs hidden in swamp vegetation. The entire ecosystem lacked the emotional familiarity humans subconsciously associate with nature. Even the colors may have appeared muted compared to modern forests. Flowering plants had not yet evolved to flood ecosystems with bright visual signals for pollinators. The Carboniferous world was probably dominated by deep greens, dark browns, black water, silver mist, and occasional flashes of reflected insect wings in dim sunlight. Some paleobotanists suggest the forests may have smelled incredibly strong as well. Rotting vegetation, stagnant water, fungal growth, and oxygen-rich air could have created dense organic odors impossible to compare directly with modern environments. Every sensory detail about this world seems slightly wrong by present-day standards. And perhaps the strangest part is how successful these forests became despite their instability. For millions of years, they covered enormous portions of Earth, feeding giant arthropods and reshaping atmospheric chemistry. But hidden inside their success was the beginning of their eventual collapse. As continental drift altered climates and the supercontinent Pangaea continued forming, many swamp regions gradually became drier. Environmental fragmentation increased. The vast, wet forests that once spread almost endlessly across equatorial zones began shrinking and breaking apart. Scientists sometimes refer to this ecological disruption as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, though the process likely unfolded over long periods rather than through one sudden catastrophe. Species adapted to humid swamp ecosystems struggled as habitats disappeared. Oxygen levels may have declined alongside changing vegetation patterns. Giant arthropods lost some of the environmental advantages that once supported them. In many ways, the forests themselves had created conditions that could not last forever. They changed the atmosphere so dramatically that Earth eventually shifted into new ecological states. There is something deeply unsettling about that pattern. The Carboniferous forests seemed permanent while they existed. Their swamps stretched beyond horizons. Their oxygen-rich air fed enormous life forms. Their vegetation buried itself into future coal fields that would survive for hundreds of millions of years. Yet even ecosystems that reshape the entire planet eventually disappear. Today, almost nothing remains of those forests except fossil impressions, buried carbon, and scattered traces preserved in stone. Entire worlds vanished so completely that humans only rediscovered them through geology. And perhaps that is why the Carboniferous forests continue to fascinate scientists and storytellers alike. They feel less like a primitive version of the modern world and more like a forgotten alternate Earth hidden beneath our own history. A world of black swamps, giant insects, oxygen-rich storms, and endless mist-covered forests where evolution briefly created ecosystems so strange that even now, long after they disappeared, they still feel closer to mythology than reality. For millions of years, the giant insects of the Carboniferous world must have seemed unstoppable. Their shadows crossed endless swamp forests beneath oxygen-rich skies. Massive arthropods moved through black wetlands as though the planet itself had been designed specifically for them. Every environmental condition appeared to favor their existence. The atmosphere fed their enormous bodies. The forests gave them shelter and food. The skies remained largely free from advanced flying competitors. If a creature living during that era could somehow understand dominance, it might have believed the age of giant arthropods would last forever. But Earth has a habit of changing slowly enough that life rarely notices disaster until it is already unfolding. The extinction of giant insects was not a single violent moment, like the asteroid impact that later helped erase the dinosaurs. There was no one day when the forests suddenly fell silent. No instant collapse visible across the horizon. Instead, the world began shifting gradually, almost invisibly at first, through climate changes, atmospheric transformations, and ecological pressures accumulating across millions of years. And that may be what makes this extinction so haunting. The rulers of prehistoric Earth did not disappear in one catastrophe. Their world slowly stopped belonging to them. One of the most important changes involved the atmosphere itself. Oxygen levels that once helped support enormous arthropods began declining over time. Scientists still debate exactly how quickly and how severely these shifts occurred in different regions, but geological evidence strongly suggests the unusually oxygen-rich conditions of the late Carboniferous did not remain stable forever. The vast swamp forests that had helped generate those oxygen levels through intense plant growth and carbon burial began fragmenting as climates changed and the supercontinent Pangaea continued forming. Areas that once remained humid and waterlogged gradually became drier. Seasonal variation increased. Forest ecosystems that had stretched almost endlessly across equatorial regions started collapsing into isolated pockets separated by changing environments. Researchers sometimes describe this transformation as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, though the word collapse can be misleading because the process likely unfolded unevenly over long spans of time rather than through one sudden event. Still, its effects may have reshaped terrestrial life permanently. Species adapted to giant swamp ecosystems suddenly faced shrinking habitats, unstable climates, and environmental conditions unlike the world in which they evolved. And unlike mammals or birds, giant arthropods may have been especially vulnerable to atmospheric change because of how tightly their biology depended on oxygen availability. Modern insects already reveal hints of these limits. Their respiratory systems function efficiently at small sizes, but larger bodies create greater challenges for oxygen transport. In a world where oxygen concentrations gradually declined, giant forms may have become harder to sustain generation after generation. Yet oxygen alone probably does not explain the full story. Nature rarely removes dominant life forms through one simple mechanism. Other changes were unfolding simultaneously. The forests themselves were changing composition. Wetland ecosystems shrank. Open landscapes expanded. And perhaps most importantly, vertebrates were evolving rapidly. Early reptiles diversified into forms increasingly adapted for life away from permanent water sources. Over immense stretches of evolutionary time, terrestrial ecosystems became more competitive and more complex. Giant arthropods no longer occupied empty ecological space. They were beginning to share the world with faster, more adaptable vertebrate lineages, capable of exploiting environments that giant insects and millipede-like creatures struggled to survive in. Some scientists also suspect predation pressures may have increased as vertebrate hunters became more advanced. The skies, once dominated almost entirely by giant insects, would eventually belong to new kinds of animals altogether. Although birds and bats evolved much later, even earlier flying vertebrates like pterosaurs eventually transformed aerial ecosystems in ways giant arthropods may never have fully recovered from. There is a disturbing pattern hidden inside this history. The giant insects did not become weak. The rules changed around them. Evolution is often imagined as survival of the strongest, but Earth's history repeatedly suggests survival belongs more often to the adaptable than the dominant. An organism can rule the planet for millions of years and still vanish once conditions shift beyond what its biology can handle. The Carboniferous giants were not failures. They were specialists, built perfectly for a world that no longer existed. And perhaps that is why their disappearance feels strangely tragic. Their extinction was not dramatic enough to become legendary like the dinosaurs, yet it reshaped Earth just as profoundly. Imagine returning to those ancient forests over millions of years as the transformation unfolded. The air slowly feels thinner. Certain swamp regions dry into harsher landscapes. The endless wet forests break apart into isolated ecosystems. Fires spread differently across changing vegetation. Giant dragonflies become less common overhead. Massive arthropods disappear from familiar territories. Generation after generation, the world grows quieter in ways no single creature fully understands. Evolution rarely allows organisms to recognize their own decline. Life continues adapting until suddenly entire lineages exist only in fossils. There is another layer to this mystery that still fascinates paleontologists today. Giant insects did not vanish completely. Their enormous forms disappeared, but insects themselves survived extraordinarily well. In fact, insects would go on to become one of the most successful groups of organisms in Earth's history. This creates a fascinating contradiction. The extinction was both catastrophic and incomplete. Evolution stripped away gigantism while preserving the underlying lineage. Modern dragonflies still carry echoes of Meganeura inside their design. Millipedes still crawl through forests, though now reduced to sizes the modern atmosphere can support more easily. In a sense, the giant arthropods did not entirely lose the evolutionary struggle. They simply became smaller participants inside a transformed world. Some researchers even speculate that smaller body sizes may have offered survival advantages once oxygen levels declined and ecosystems fragmented. Smaller organisms require fewer resources, reproduce more quickly, and often adapt faster to unstable conditions. The giant forms that once symbolized dominance may eventually have become liabilities instead. And hidden inside that possibility is one of evolution's most uncomfortable truths. Traits that create success during one age can become weaknesses during another. The very features that made giant insects extraordinary may have trapped them when the environment changed. What once gave them power may also have prevented flexibility. Yet, despite all the scientific evidence surrounding atmospheric shifts and ecological change, there are still unanswered questions about the exact timing and mechanisms behind these extinctions. Fossil records remain incomplete. Certain species disappear suddenly in some regions, but linger longer elsewhere. Climate systems across the ancient supercontinent were incredibly complex. Some paleontologists argue competition from evolving vertebrates played a larger role than oxygen decline alone. Others emphasize habitat fragmentation or changing plant ecosystems. Most likely, multiple pressures interacted together in ways impossible to fully separate now. Earth's major transitions rarely occur because of one single cause. They emerge from countless interconnected changes building over geological time until ecosystems cross invisible thresholds. And perhaps the most haunting part is how quietly this entire transformation happened compared to later mass extinctions. There was no asteroid lighting the sky, no global apocalypse recognizable from one lifetime to the next. The age of giant insects faded slowly into deep time, almost unnoticed except through fossils buried beneath ancient sediments. Entire species vanished, while continents drifted inch by inch across the planet. Forests disappeared, one region at a time. Atmospheres shifted, molecule by molecule. Evolution continued moving forward with no concern for what had once ruled the Earth. Today, when humans see dragonflies hovering above ponds, or millipedes moving silently through damp soil, it is easy to dismiss them as small background creatures in a world dominated by mammals and birds. But those modern insects are survivors from a lineage older than dinosaurs, older than flowering plants, older than most ecosystems humans recognize. They are remnants of an age when arthropods once towered over the land and ruled prehistoric skies beneath oxygen-rich clouds. And perhaps that is the strangest realization of all. The world humans think of as permanent is only another temporary arrangement of life. Long before mammals dominated Earth, giant insects already rose, thrived, and vanished almost completely. Their extinction was not loud enough to become myth. It happened quietly, over millions of years, while the planet slowly rewrote the conditions of existence itself. And somewhere inside that forgotten silence, beneath changing skies and dying swamp forests, the age of giant arthropods came to an end without ever knowing it was ending at all. Even though the age of giant insects disappeared hundreds of millions of years ago, traces of that lost world are still alive around us. They drift above quiet ponds at sunset. They hide beneath damp stones after rainstorms. They cling to tree bark, move through grass, or vanish into shadows so ordinary that most people never stop to think about what they are really looking at. But some modern creatures are more than surviving animals. They are echoes from a planet so ancient that it existed before dinosaurs, before birds, before flowering plants covered the earth. And once you realize that, modern insects begin to feel strangely different. A dragonfly hovering over water no longer looks small and harmless. It starts to resemble the final surviving fragment of a forgotten aerial empire. Scientists sometimes use the term living fossil to describe organisms that appear remarkably similar to ancient ancestors preserved in the fossil record. The phrase can be misleading because evolution never truly stops, even in species that change slowly over immense spans of time. Modern organisms continue adapting genetically in subtle ways, but some lineages preserve body structures and survival strategies so effectively that they seem to carry deep prehistoric memory inside their design. Dragonflies are among the clearest examples. Their ancestors ruled Carboniferous skies long before vertebrate flight became dominant. And even today, their anatomy remains astonishingly efficient. Their enormous compound eyes still detect motion with incredible precision. Their wings still allow sudden hovering, rapid acceleration, and impossible-looking turns in mid-air. Their hunting style still resembles a biological targeting system more than the clumsy flight many people associate with insects. In fact, researchers studying dragonfly predation have discovered that these insects often predict the future position of prey rather than simply chasing movement directly. They intercept targets with a level of aerial calculation that seems almost mechanical. Watching one hunt above water today is like witnessing a tiny surviving machine from another geological age, still functioning almost exactly as evolution intended hundreds of millions of years ago. And perhaps the strangest part is that humans coexist with these ancient lineages constantly, without noticing how old they truly are. A dragonfly landing near a lake appears temporary, delicate, forgettable. Yet its ancestors existed before the first dinosaur ever walked across Earth. Entire empires of vertebrate life rose and disappeared, while dragonfly lineages survived through atmospheric shifts, climate catastrophes, mass extinctions, and continental rearrangements. The same can be said for many arthropods still alive today. Millipedes creeping through wet soil may appear primitive compared to mammals or birds, but their evolutionary history stretches back toward the age when giant, multi-legged arthropods once moved through carboniferous forests beneath oxygen-rich skies. Horseshoe crabs, though not insects, are another extraordinary example of survival across deep time. Their ancestors existed long before dinosaurs and retained body plans so successful that modern horseshoe crabs still resemble ancient fossil relatives from hundreds of millions of years ago. There is something deeply humbling about that continuity. Humans often think of intelligence or complexity as the highest evolutionary achievement. Yet some of the longest-lasting life forms on Earth succeeded not by becoming more elaborate, but by becoming efficient enough to endure environmental chaos across unimaginable stretches of time. Some scientists argue the phrase "living fossil" unfairly implies stagnation, as though these creatures somehow failed to evolve. But survival itself may represent one of evolution's greatest accomplishments. Most species that ever existed are gone. Entire branches of Earth's biological history vanished completely. Yet certain arthropod lineages endured nearly everything the planet could throw at them. Mass extinctions destroyed giant reptiles. Ice ages reshaped continents. Asteroid impacts darkened skies. Oceans rose and fell repeatedly. Still, dragonflies continued flying above water. Millipedes continued moving through forests. Cockroaches survived environmental disasters that erased countless supposedly superior organisms. Insects succeeded not because they dominated through size or strength forever, but because they adapted with extraordinary resilience. And perhaps that resilience is what truly connects modern insects to their giant prehistoric ancestors. The giant forms disappeared, but the deeper survival strategies remained. Small body sizes, rapid reproduction, flexible diets, and efficient biological systems allowed insects to persist where larger, specialized creatures failed. There is an uncomfortable irony hidden inside that pattern. Humans often dismiss insects as weak or insignificant precisely because they are small. Yet, smallness may have been the evolutionary advantage that saved them when Earth's conditions transformed. Some researchers even suggest insects became more evolutionarily successful after losing gigantism, because smaller bodies made them more adaptable across changing climates and ecosystems. The terrifying giants of the Carboniferous vanished, but their descendants quietly spread across nearly every environment on the planet. Today, insects occupy deserts, rainforests, mountaintops, freshwater systems, caves, and even frozen polar regions. By some estimates, insects make up the majority of known animal species on Earth. In terms of evolutionary endurance, few groups can rival them. And hidden inside that success are behaviors modern humans barely understand. Ant colonies operate through decentralized systems so complex that researchers compare them to biological superorganisms. Certain beetles navigate using starlight. Dragonflies migrate across continents with astonishing precision, despite tiny nervous systems. Some insects survive freezing temperatures by altering their body chemistry. Others can remain dormant for years, waiting for environmental conditions to improve. The more scientists study arthropods, the more they reveal forms of intelligence, adaptation, and sensory perception radically different from vertebrate life. It becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss them as primitive. Instead, they begin to feel like survivors shaped by evolutionary pressures so ancient that mammals arrived comparatively late to the story. And yet, despite their incredible resilience, many modern insect populations are now declining in alarming ways. Habitat destruction, pesticides, climate change, pollution, and ecosystem fragmentation have caused measurable reductions in insect biomass across parts of the world. Some scientists warn these declines could eventually destabilize food webs, pollination systems, and ecological functions modern ecosystems depend upon. There is something deeply unsettling about that possibility. The descendants of creatures that survived hundreds of millions of years of planetary upheaval may now face new pressures created within just a few centuries of human industrial activity. Of course, insect populations are extraordinarily complex, and scientists continue debating the scale, regional variation, and long-term implications of these declines. Some species adapt successfully, while others collapse. But the broader pattern raises uncomfortable questions about resilience itself. Even the most ancient survivors remain vulnerable when environmental change accelerates too rapidly. And perhaps that realization changes the emotional meaning of modern insects entirely. A dragonfly above a pond is no longer just a small summer insect. It becomes part of a lineage older than forests as humans know them. A millipede moving through wet leaves becomes the distant relative of colossal arthropods that once ruled prehistoric ground ecosystems. Even the simplest insect carries evolutionary memory extending farther back than human imagination comfortably grasps. Their survival links the modern world directly to a vanished Earth of black swamps, oxygen-rich air, giant wings, and endless prehistoric storms. Sometimes the fossil record itself makes this connection almost eerie. Paleontologists occasionally uncover ancient insect fossils so well preserved that they look strangely modern at first glance. Wing structures, body segmentation, compound eyes, certain features remain instantly recognizable despite the immense gulf of time separating those organisms from the present day. It creates the unsettling feeling that prehistoric Earth never disappeared completely. Pieces of it survived quietly all around us. Not as monsters anymore, but as smaller descendants carrying the same ancient engineering refined across geological ages. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery hidden inside these so-called living relics. They remind us that extinction is rarely absolute. The world that giant insects once ruled is gone, yet fragments of it still move through modern skies and forests every day. Humans simply stopped recognizing them as survivors from another age. But once you truly see a dragonfly for what it represents, a descendant of one of Earth's oldest aerial dynasties, it becomes impossible to watch one hover silently above water without sensing something ancient behind its wings. Something older than dinosaurs, older than mammals. A living reminder that the prehistoric world did not vanish entirely. Part of it is still here, drifting quietly through the modern world, almost unnoticed. If giant insects suddenly returned to the modern world tomorrow, most people imagine the result would look like a horror movie. Dragonflies the size of hawks crossing city skylines, spiders large enough to hide beneath cars, centipedes moving through subway tunnels while entire neighborhoods panic in the dark. Human imagination almost automatically turns giant arthropods into monsters, because insects already trigger deep instinctive discomfort at normal size. Scale them upward, and the fear multiplies instantly. But the real answer is stranger and far more complicated than simple terror. Because the truth is that giant insects probably could not just come back without the entire planet changing with them. The age of giant arthropods was not created by insects alone. It was created by a completely different Earth. And that means bringing those creatures back would likely require reshaping the atmosphere, ecosystems, climate, and biological balance of the modern world itself. In other words, if giant insects truly returned, humans would not simply be facing larger bugs. They would be living on a planet becoming increasingly unfamiliar. Scientists have debated for decades exactly how large insects could theoretically grow under modern conditions. Oxygen remains one of the biggest factors in this discussion because insects still rely on respiratory systems fundamentally different from mammal lungs. Their bodies distribute oxygen through branching air tubes rather than pumping it through blood the way vertebrates do. As body size increases, this system becomes less efficient. That is one reason most modern insects remain relatively small. Experiments performed on some insects under oxygen-rich laboratory conditions have shown modest increases in body size, suggesting atmospheric chemistry does influence growth. But recreating Carboniferous scale gigantism would likely require much more than simply increasing oxygen levels slightly. Modern ecosystems are radically different from prehistoric ones. Today's skies are filled with birds, bats, and countless vertebrate predators that giant insects would need to compete against. Forest structures have changed. Temperatures fluctuate differently. Atmospheric density itself may play a role. Scientists still do not fully understand. The modern world is not designed for giant arthropods in the way Carboniferous Earth once was. Yet the possibility remains fascinating because nature occasionally reveals glimpses of how flexible size limits can become under the right conditions. Some tropical insects already grow surprisingly large. The Goliath beetle can can reach sizes that feel unnervingly oversized in human hands. Giant stick insects stretch longer than forearms. Certain tarantulas possess leg spans wide enough to trigger primal fear instantly. Japanese spider crabs, though not insects, demonstrate how arthropod body plans can still produce massive forms under specific environmental pressures. In isolated ecosystems where competition, climate, and food availability align correctly, nature continues pushing size boundaries farther than many people expect. That raises an unsettling question. If Earth's atmosphere gradually shifted again over thousands or millions of years, could arthropods begin increasing in size once more? Some scientists think larger insects might indeed become more viable under higher oxygen conditions, though probably not overnight, and not necessarily at the extreme scales seen during the Carboniferous. Others argue modern ecosystems contain too many biological constraints for giant arthropods to dominate again the way they once did. Vertebrate predators evolved specifically within a world already crowded by competition. Birds and mammals occupy ecological roles giant insects would struggle to reclaim. In many ways, modern ecosystems are faster, more aggressive, and more crowded than Carboniferous environments. But even if giant arthropods never fully returned to prehistoric sizes, relatively modest increases alone could dramatically alter human psychology. A dragonfly with a 3-foot wingspan does not need to attack humans to become terrifying. Humans evolved with deep, instinctive reactions toward arthropods because many insects and arachnids carry venom, disease, or unpredictable movement patterns. Enlarging those features magnifies emotional responses automatically. Part of the fear comes from movement itself. Mammals move in ways humans intuitively understand because we share similar skeletal structures and body language. Arthropods operate differently. Their segmented limbs, rapid directional shifts, and expressionless faces create an emotional distance that often feels unsettling, even when the creatures are harmless. Scale that upward, and the effect becomes almost surreal. Imagine hearing the sound of giant insect wings moving through humid evening air outside a suburban neighborhood. Not roaring like a bird or airplane, but producing dry mechanical vibrations unlike any large animal humans normally encounter. The sound alone would likely trigger panic before the creature even appeared. Yet scientifically speaking, giant insects might not actually become the most dangerous animals in such a world. Arthropod biology contains important limitations. Exoskeletons become increasingly heavy and difficult to support at larger sizes. Molting becomes more dangerous. Oxygen transport still imposes restrictions. Gravity affects body structures differently as organisms scale upward. Some researchers suspect giant arthropods of the Carboniferous may have moved more slowly than modern reconstructions sometimes portray, simply because enormous exoskeletons create mechanical challenges vertebrates avoid through internal skeletons. In other words, giant insects may look terrifying while still remaining ecologically vulnerable compared to mammals, reptiles, or birds occupying similar niches today. But perhaps the more disturbing possibility is not that giant insects would hunt humans. It is that their existence would signal Earth itself changing into something less stable and less familiar. If atmospheric oxygen rose enough to support dramatically larger arthropods, it would likely reshape wildfire behavior, plant growth patterns, and climate interactions as well. Forest ecosystems could transform. Some species would flourish, while others collapsed. Entire food webs would reorganize. Human civilization depends heavily on environmental stability, especially agricultural systems built around relatively predictable climate conditions. A planet capable of sustaining giant arthropods again might also become a planet increasingly difficult for modern civilization to manage comfortably. There is another fascinating angle to this idea that scientists occasionally discuss more quietly. Insects already possess remarkable evolutionary advantages compared to larger animals. They reproduce quickly. They adapt rapidly. Many species can survive extreme conditions. Some insects evolve resistance to pesticides within surprisingly short time frames. Others spread across continents through trade networks and climate shifts almost effortlessly. If environmental conditions ever favored larger arthropod forms again, evolution could theoretically respond faster in insects than in many vertebrate groups, simply because insects cycle through generations so rapidly. That does not mean giant dragonflies would suddenly appear within centuries, but it highlights how dynamic insect evolution remains even now. And hidden inside all this speculation is a deeper truth about Earth that humans rarely like confronting. The modern world feels permanent only because human lifespans are short. Across geological time, ecosystems transform repeatedly into forms almost impossible to predict beforehand. If someone from the Carboniferous somehow saw modern Earth, they might find mammals bizarre and improbable. Cities would appear incomprehensible. Birds filling the sky might seem as strange to them as giant dragonflies seem to us. Evolution does not move toward a final destination. It constantly reshapes life according to changing conditions. The giant arthropods disappeared because Earth changed. If Earth changes again far enough into the future, entirely new forms of life may emerge that modern humans would consider equally alien. Some scientists even speculate climate change and warming temperatures already influence insect distribution and growth patterns in subtle ways today. Certain species are expanding into new territories. Others are shrinking or collapsing. Ecological pressure constantly reshuffles survival advantages. Of course, none of this suggests giant prehistoric insects are about to return anytime soon. Modern atmospheric conditions, ecological competition, and biological constraints make a true Carboniferous-style world extremely unlikely in the near future. But the idea remains powerful because it exposes how fragile human assumptions about nature really are. People tend to imagine the modern scale of life as normal, almost inevitable. Yet Earth's history proves otherwise. Giant arthropods once existed not because fantasy demanded them, but because the planet itself temporarily allowed them. And perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. The ancient world of giant insects was not impossible. It was real. It existed beneath different skies, inside different forests, under atmospheric conditions that transformed what evolution could create. And while that world disappeared hundreds of millions of years ago, the possibility itself remains buried inside Earth's history, like a reminder that the boundaries humans consider natural are often only temporary rules written by the current version of the planet. Most people can stand calmly beside a horse, a deer, or even a large dog without feeling immediate panic. But place a spider on the wall at midnight, or let a cockroach suddenly move across the floor, and the reaction changes instantly. Hearts race, muscles tense. Some people freeze completely, while others jump backward before consciously understanding why. The strange part is that this fear often appears disproportionate to the actual danger involved. Many insects are harmless. Most spiders want nothing to do with humans. Yet, across cultures, continents, and generations, arthropods consistently trigger discomfort in ways few other animals do. And that raises a fascinating question hidden deep inside human psychology. Why are humans so disturbed by creatures that are usually small enough to crush beneath a shoe? Part of the answer may reach farther back into evolutionary history than most people realize. Long before cities, before agriculture, before civilization itself, early humans and human ancestors evolved in environments where rapid detection of dangerous small creatures could mean survival. Venomous spiders, stinging insects, disease-carrying parasites, and hidden predators created constant environmental threats. Unlike large predators that could often be heard or seen approaching, insects and arachnids operated differently. They appeared suddenly. They hid in dark places. They moved unpredictably. Many carried toxins or disease disproportionate to their size. Natural selection may therefore have favored humans who reacted quickly, even excessively, to certain movement patterns and body shapes associated with potential danger. In other words, the modern fear of insects may not be irrational at all. It may be an ancient survival system still operating inside the human nervous system, long after many of the original dangers diminished. Researchers studying fear responses have found that humans often detect spider-like shapes and rapid arthropod movement faster than many other visual stimuli. Some experiments suggest even infants and very young children show heightened attention towards spiders and snakes before learning cultural fear behaviors. Scientists continue debating how much of insect fear is inherited versus socially conditioned. But evidence increasingly suggests the human brain may be unusually sensitive to certain visual patterns linked to arthropods. And perhaps that sensitivity becomes even stronger because insects move in ways humans instinctively struggle to predict. Mammals share recognizable body language with us. We understand the emotional meaning of a dog lowering its head or a cat preparing to pounce. Because vertebrates share similar structural movement patterns, arthropods feel different. Their limbs move too quickly or too mechanically. Their bodies lack expressions humans emotionally recognize. Their eyes often appear unreadable. Even harmless insects can seem emotionally empty in ways mammals rarely do. A dragonfly, hovering motionless before darting sideways instantly, does not move like a bird. A centipede racing across a wall does not move like any vertebrate humans evolved alongside comfortably. The unpredictability itself creates tension. The human brain constantly tries to anticipate movement, and insects violate those expectations in subtle ways that trigger discomfort before conscious reasoning catches up. Scale also matters less than people think. A tiger is objectively more dangerous than a spider, Yet many individuals experience stronger immediate fear toward the spider because small arthropods activate ancient reflexes tied to contamination, venom, infestation, and hidden danger. Some psychologists believe disgust and fear became deeply linked in human evolution, specifically because avoiding disease carriers was critical for survival. Insects crawling across food, skin, or living spaces may unconsciously trigger contamination alarms built into the human mind long before modern medicine existed. That connection between insects and disease became especially powerful throughout human history. Fleas helped spread the Black Death across medieval Europe. Mosquitoes carried malaria and yellow fever across continents. Lice thrived during wars and famine. Entire civilizations fought invisible biological threats transmitted by small arthropods humans barely understood at the time. In many ways, insects shaped human history far more than most people realize. Some historians even argue mosquito-borne diseases altered military campaigns, colonization patterns, and political outcomes throughout the ancient and early modern world. Tiny organisms influenced empires. And perhaps, deep down, human psychology remembers that vulnerability. There is also something uniquely unsettling about the sheer alienness of arthropods themselves. Insects represent a completely different evolutionary design from vertebrates. Their skeletons sit outside the body instead of inside. Their eyes work differently. Their breathing systems operate through spiracles and air tubes rather than lungs. Some species perceive ultraviolet patterns invisible to humans. Others navigate through vibrations, chemical trails, or polarized light. They do not merely look different from humans, they experience reality differently. And the human brain often reacts strongly to organisms that feel difficult to emotionally interpret. This may explain why insects dominate horror imagery across cultures, despite their small size. Giant spiders, swarming locusts, parasitic wasps, and crawling infestations appear repeatedly in myths, films, and nightmares, because arthropods already feel slightly unnatural to human perception even under ordinary conditions. Scale them upward, and the discomfort multiplies immediately. A giant wolf still resembles a large mammal humans conceptually understand. A giant centipede becomes something psychologically harder to process because the human brain never evolved to feel comfortable around oversized arthropod movement. Some neuroscientists suspect the fear response intensifies because insects violate normal expectations of proportion and motion simultaneously. Yet, despite all this fear, humans also display a strange fascination with insects that borders on obsession. People who recoil from spiders still watch documentaries about them for hours. Children become mesmerized by ants carrying objects larger than themselves. Dragonflies inspire admiration rather than disgust in many cultures. Butterflies became symbols of beauty, transformation, and spirituality across civilizations worldwide. This contradiction reveals something important. Humans do not simply fear insects. They are unsettled by them because insects feel ancient, resilient, and fundamentally outside ordinary human emotional categories. Watching a spider build a web or a praying mantis track movement can feel eerily intelligent without resembling human intelligence at all. Insects often appear less like animals and more like biological systems executing ancient instructions beyond human understanding. And scientifically speaking, that impression is not entirely wrong. Insects evolved hundreds of millions of years before humans. Their nervous systems solved survival problems through pathways radically different from mammalian evolution. Some species operate collectively through colony behavior so efficient it resembles decentralized computation. Others survive environments that would kill larger animals almost instantly. Certain insects can detect polarized light, magnetic fields, or chemical signals at levels humans can barely imagine. The more science learns about arthropods, the stranger they become. And perhaps part of human fear comes from recognizing, somewhere instinctively, that insects are not primitive failures of evolution. They are survivors from a biological world older than mammals themselves. There is even a theory among some evolutionary psychologists that human fear of insects because insects often behave in overwhelming numbers rather than as individuals. A single wolf is dangerous. A swarm of locusts darkening the sky feels apocalyptic. Ant colonies consuming food supplies, termites destroying structures, mosquitoes spreading disease across entire populations. Arthropods frequently operate through scale rather than individual strength. That kind of threat activates different psychological responses because humans struggle emotionally with systems too large or numerous to control directly. Swarms feel less like predators and more like natural disasters with legs and wings. Modern media continues intensifying these ancient reactions. Horror films regularly portray insects as symbols of uncontrollable invasion, mutation, or hidden contamination. Giant spiders, flesh-burrowing parasites, and swarming creatures dominate fictional nightmares because arthropods already exist near the edge of human psychological comfort. Yet, at the same time, modern science increasingly reveals how essential insects are to ecosystems humans depend upon. Pollination, decomposition, soil health, food chains. Without insects, most terrestrial ecosystems would collapse rapidly. The creatures humans fear helped build and maintain the biological systems supporting modern civilization. And perhaps that is the deepest irony hidden inside humanity's relationship with insects. Humans fear them because they seem alien, uncontrollable, and ancient. But those same qualities are exactly what made insects some of the most successful organisms Earth has ever produced. They survived atmospheric transformations, mass extinctions, ice ages, and planetary upheavals long before humans appeared. In a sense, human discomfort around insects may partly come from confronting forms of life that evolved according to rules completely different from our own. Creatures that do not think like mammals, move like mammals, or emotionally resemble mammals, yet still conquered nearly every environment on Earth. And maybe that is why a spider appearing silently in the corner of a dark room still feels strangely unsettling even now. Somewhere deep inside the human mind, beneath logic and modern understanding, there may still linger an ancient instinct whispering that these small creatures belong to something older than us, remnants of a world that existed long before humans ever learned to fear the dark. Tonight, if someone stands beside a quiet lake just after sunset, they might see a dragonfly moving silently above the water for only a few seconds before it disappears into darkness. Most people would barely notice it. The insect would seem small, ordinary, temporary. But hidden inside that brief movement is a connection reaching back into a world so ancient that almost nothing from it still survives in recognizable form. Long before humans existed, before mammals ruled the land, before dinosaurs ever walked across Earth, this planet belonged to creatures almost nobody remembers. Not because they were unimportant, but because time erased them so completely that their world now feels more like myth than history. The giant insects, the endless swamp forests, the oxygen-rich skies, the colossal arthropods moving through black wetlands. All of it existed for millions upon millions of years. Entire evolutionary empires rose and vanished before the first human ancestor ever looked at the stars. And perhaps the strangest part is realizing how easily Earth forgets its rulers. Humans tend to imagine history through a human lens. Ancient civilizations feel old because they stretch back thousands of years. Dinosaurs feel unimaginably distant because they vanished 66 million years ago. But the Carboniferous world existed more than 300 million years in the past, during an age so remote that the planet itself barely resembled the modern Earth. Continents sat in different positions. Forests spread across endless tropical wetlands where coal would one day form beneath layers of buried vegetation. The atmosphere carried far more oxygen than modern air. The skies belonged to giant arthropods because vertebrate flight had not yet truly arrived. And beneath those prehistoric clouds, evolution experimented with forms of life so strange that modern humans instinctively struggled to accept they were ever real. Yet, they were real. Fossils, preserved in stone, prove it. Giant dragonflies, with wingspans wider than birds, once hunted above swamp waters. Arthropods, longer than humans, crawled silently through forests. Ancient ecosystems operated according to biological rules completely different from those shaping the modern world. And then, slowly, everything changed. The forests collapsed. Oxygen levels shifted. Climates transformed. Giant insects disappeared. New creatures rose afterward and inherited the planet. Then those rulers vanished too. Dinosaurs once seemed permanent, until an asteroid impact and environmental collapse erased nearly all of them. Mammals rose after that. Humans arrived much later still. Every age believes itself stable while it exists. Every dominant species assumes, in an evolutionary sense, that the world belongs to it now. Yet Earth's history repeatedly tells a different story. The planet changes. Atmospheres change. Oceans change. Continents drift. Entire ecosystems vanish so completely that future life forms may never even imagine they existed. There is something deeply humbling hidden inside that realization. Humans often view themselves as separate from nature because civilization creates the illusion of permanence. Cities, roads, technology, and artificial light make the modern world feel insulated from deep time. But beneath every city lie geological layers recording worlds older than human memory. Coal burned in industrial furnaces once belonged to prehistoric swamp forests. Limestone cliffs contain the compressed remains of ancient oceans. Fossils hidden beneath mountains preserve creatures that ruled Earth before mammals even evolved. The modern world is built physically on top of forgotten planets disguised as earlier versions of Earth. And perhaps that is why prehistoric life feels simultaneously fascinating and unsettling. It forces humans to confront how temporary every age truly is. There was once a time when giant arthropods represented evolutionary success so overwhelming that they spread across vast ecosystems under oxygen-rich skies. If consciousness had existed strongly enough to observe that world, it might have seemed impossible that such creatures could ever disappear. Yet eventually, almost all traces of their dominance vanished, except for fossil fragments and a few surviving descendants still moving quietly through modern forests and wetlands today. Insects themselves never disappeared. They adapted, they shrank, they transformed alongside the changing planet. Dragonflies still hover above ponds. Millipedes still crawl through damp soil. Small echoes of the Carboniferous continue surviving around us, almost unnoticed. And that continuity may be one of the most haunting aspects of Earth's history. Extinction is rarely absolute. Pieces of lost worlds remain embedded inside the present. A dragonfly crossing evening light carries ancient aerodynamic designs older than dinosaurs. A horseshoe crab moving through shallow coastal water resembles creatures that survived planetary catastrophes beyond human imagination. Even the forests humans walk through today still depend on evolutionary systems shaped partly by ancient plant worlds that no longer exist. The past never disappears entirely. It leaves fragments behind, like shadows beneath the modern world. Some scientists argue humans are living through another major biological transition now. Climate systems are changing rapidly. Species disappear at accelerating rates. Ecosystems shift under pressure from industrial activity, pollution, habitat destruction, and warming temperatures. Of course, modern extinction events differ enormously from the slow geological transformations that reshaped the Carboniferous world. Human civilization introduces entirely new forces into Earth's systems. Yet, the broader pattern feels disturbingly familiar. Dominant life forms alter planetary conditions, and eventually, those altered conditions begin reshaping life in return. Earth does not remain frozen for the comfort of any species. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden inside the forgotten age of giant insects. The planet does not belong permanently to anyone. Not to arthropods, not to dinosaurs, not to mammals, not even to humans. Every ecosystem, every dominant species, every civilization exists inside temporary environmental conditions that can eventually shift beyond recognition. The Carboniferous forests once stretched endlessly across the planet, beneath skies thick with oxygen and giant wings. Today, almost nothing remains, except buried carbon and scattered fossils pressed into stone. One day, perhaps millions of years from now, future life forms may study traces of humanity the same way humans study ancient arthropods now, trying to reconstruct a vanished world from fragments hidden underground. Cities may become strange geological layers. Plastics may fossilize into ancient sediments. The creatures ruling Earth at that time may look back at human civilization with the same disbelief modern humans feel toward giant dragonflies and colossal millipedes. And perhaps they too will struggle to understand how something so dominant could disappear. Yet, despite all this, there is also something strangely beautiful about Earth's endless transformation. The world keeps reinventing itself. Life keeps adapting, surviving, vanishing, and returning in new forms. The giant insects disappeared, but their descendants still drift quietly above modern lakes at dusk. Ancient forests collapsed, yet new forests grew afterward beneath different skies. Evolution never stops experimenting. Even now, somewhere deep in a rainforest, desert, cave, or ocean trench, life continues adapting in ways humans may barely understand until far in the future. The planet remains unfinished. And maybe that is why the story of giant insects feels so powerful long after their age ended. It reminds us that Earth is older, stranger, and far less stable than human civilization usually allows itself to believe. Before mammals, before dinosaurs, before humanity ever existed, there were other rulers beneath other skies. Their kingdoms lasted millions of years. Then they vanished almost completely, leaving behind only fossils, fragments, and silent wings moving through modern twilight like memories from a forgotten Earth no one alive can truly remember anymore. Thanks for spending tonight with Sleepy Earth Channel. If you enjoyed drifting through this forgotten prehistoric world, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Wishing you a peaceful night, deep rest, and good luck wherever you are in the world. And I'll see you again in the next journey through Earth's ancient past.